All right, Annie and Jay, let's begin. Reflecting on the liberation theologies. Question one, as you consider the liberation theologies, what was the most compelling to you?
I mean, I feel like, and maybe this feels like a cop out, but I feel like they all were compelling to me for different reasons. And I feel like they're all different enough to where for me to like pick or choose one feels really challenging.
Hmm.
I think one that's really applicable for my internship right now is Black liberation theology, just because the bulk of the population that I'm working with is Black and brown folks, particularly Black men.
Hmm.
And so I think like using that within social work practice for some of my clients who maybe do identify as Christian, would maybe just feel like something for them that, yeah, just like really resonates and feels powerful and it just like fits the scope of their life, especially within the criminal justice system, which is where my internship is.
Nice. Do you,
Yeah.
and
Sorry, go ahead.
for me, um I enjoyed all of them actually. I love how they connected, how there was connection with like poverty and racism and how it wasn't like God was still there through it all, in a certain way. And I loved how it all had the connection and it came back to God. And I love how um faith should lead to action and not just prayer, or poverty is not an accident. So I kind of enjoyed all of them,
Mhm.
honestly. yeah, all of them were really powerful. Since you brought up Black liberation specifically, Annie, do you remember the podcast of the episode that we had to listen to from the Glenn show with Cornell West, the conversations with Cornell West?
Mhm.
Um, I love Cornell West, so I was excited that that was one of the things that we got to listen to. And what really struck me from their conversation was when he um, was talking about the ongoing cultural and spiritual struggle. And like this is, and I quote, he said, we're living in like an era of spiritual decay and moral breakdown, and like how that's tied to how everything is so market driven, and like how capitalism just flattens things and flattens culture, and how like the things that oppressed people have held on to is like liberatory, like their art or just the things that feel grounding have ultimately been like co-opted by capitalism and just turned into a commodity. And I just found that particular framing so powerful, and how like things that could be like tools or mediums of liberation, even those things are just flattened into products by these oppressive systems.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like that really resonates and I even think like on a larger scale and I don't mean to just like keep talking about my internship, but I think again like that's where I see it so apparently even like for-profit prison systems and like literally turning people into commodities.
Hmm.
And like particularly black and brown folks, specifically black men, for, you know, the obvious reasons like prison to school to prison pipelines or, you know, the war on drugs, whatever that root cause might be, though there's many. Yeah, I think to that point, like capitalism really does drive people, things, all of it
Hmm.
into a commodity.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, even just like human connection is a commodity. Like we
Hmm.
see this with social media, with TikTok, and
Hmm.
like everything just being about like how can I perform this feeling for approval? Like it just like even connection has become a product that we're consuming and not experiencing.
Yeah.
Um, so I just felt like that really,
That
yeah, was
is so
very
deep. How what you just said about like how it's a product that we're consuming. Um,
and not
that was
experiencing.
yeah, that's deep. That's definitely something that's gonna like make me think a little
Oh,
more. I appreciate that. Thanks for that.
oh,
Hmm.
thank you. I also really loved Gutierrez at how he incorporated Marxism into his theology and like how he was really careful about and like disciplined in that integration. Um, so like how he distinguished it from what did I have here? Like it was like a social tool instead of like a totalitizing ideology, like how it like just talking about how Marxist theory um let's see, how did I phrase this? Um yeah, it can be employed to examine economic exploitation and structural injustice, but must remain accountable to theological ethics. I just really thought that was an interesting way to incorporate that into theology and something Christian based when it's like a secular um theory, you know.
Hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. I guess I didn't pick up on it that way, so I appreciate you describing it that way. I think there's like even you think about, I remember my first semester at Bethel as an undergrad student where they would talk about how like the United States is literally a welfare state, but then it's like you
Mhm.
hear these hot button words about it of like disagreeing or agreeing. It's like sometimes it's just factual. And so like how we're intertwining that with our faith or theology, whatever that looks like, I think it does become structural, especially when part of the theology is about oppression and socioeconomic oppression specifically.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of hard to not talk about those government structures or whatever it might be at the same time. They almost have to integrate.
Mhm. Yes. Great. Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
All right. I feel like these are pretty similar, but what liberation theology stood out to you the most and why?
I can touch on disability theology. I don't know if it just stood out to me because that's the most recent one. But this one, I don't know. I wrote some notes down. I think throughout there was multiple podcasts, and some of them made really interesting point. I think the bulk of the point was like people framing disability as a problem, and I think in social work, like it really opened my eyes to like being careful of falling into that trap. I think autism is one of those where like now as social workers or mental health professionals, we've evolved in being like, of course, autism is not a bad thing. It should be celebrated, all of these things. But there was a point not so long ago, where like social workers maybe did still have the view of it being something that needs to be changed. And so even when we think about diagnoses, like one that comes to my mind is personality disorders. I think there's still a stigmatized rhetoric around like this needs to be changed, or these people are bad, or they need help. And I just don't know that that's completely true. And so I think, and I know like personality disorders aren't even necessarily a disability, but I think again, because of our rhetoric and the stigma, they kind of can fall into that trap. Um, but just like as social workers and like the podcast talks about, like how are we making sure that we're not over medicalizing what our clients are going through? And I know that this is probably skipping a little bit more into the last question, intangible practice of social work. But yeah, I think it just brought up a lot of interesting points for me, even again, as I'm going through my internship, being like, okay, well, maybe this person just like doesn't necessarily need medication, or why is the court system like saying that this is so bad? So just taking a broader scope of deviating from what the baseline of normal is in our society isn't bad or wrong.
Hmm. Yes.
The disability theology, I love how you just explained it because I agree. I feel as if because people have disabilities, sometimes like the stigma behind it is like they're not normal because they have a disability, and the reality is that they're just as valuable as we are. You
Mm,
know, disability shouldn't be something that people should look at as like we need to fix, because you there's barriers, but let's work to find the solutions, like instead of looking at them less than, or like I have a coworker who has a son who has a disability, and the schools kind of labels, so he can't walk, right? And he uses his words. But I mean, in a situation like that, I understand where he would use his words to defend himself because he can't like walk, like he can't physically harm you.
mm.
And she gets frustrated with the school sometimes because he'll say things that kids shouldn't say, but then they're quick to label him as, oh, he's just a bad kid, or he's very inappropriate, or like we shouldn't have him in class around other kids because of the things he says. And it's like, well, I disagree with that because, I mean, yes, speak to your kid and let them know that there are certain things that shouldn't be said around other kids, but don't see him as a threat. Like it
Or like
just,
shame him in some way.
yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's a really good example. Yeah, I'm really also the disability theology resonated on a lot of fronts. So it intersects like with my personal experience living with disability, and then my first field placement experience was with Build, so supporting young adults with intellectual disabilities. Did you go to Bethel for undergrad? Like
Yeah.
you and did you just graduate? So you know about Build.
Yeah, I graduated in 21 or 22. But anyways, yeah, there was a few people in my cohort who did their internships with Build.
Okay.
Um, I still like there is certain people who are part of Build that I just like love. Like every year on
Yeah.
Facebook, talking to them over birthdays and stuff. Anyways, I
Mhm.
digress, but it's a super cool program.
It is, yeah. So that was really an amazing opportunity and experience. And it's still like since I still work on campus, I still get to see the students that I and still get to connect with them. So that's really cool. Um, but yeah, I really loved the disabled guide. I feel like this particular module came um kind of at a good like point, an unexpected point, and became very grounding. I will just be transparent. I have bipolar and ADHD, which really it really makes a big difference in the way like my executive functioning works, and like how I experience the world. And so even though like the disabled God focused on physical disabilities, the theological substance of the work um, just articulated very well like what it means to live in a society that's organized around like this like ethos of able-bodiedness, and how the world being framed or like just set up for a particular type of existence that's considered acceptable or right um, can just be like a very yeah, isolating experience. And I just like I really especially the part where it was talking about, so you do you remember the beginning where they were Diane DeVries and Nancy Meyers, like where they were showing their, that was chapter 2, where they were talking about like the experience of being in their body, um and how like um recognizing that like the adaptations that you need to and like integrate into your life to make things work are like not compensations for deficits, but like different expressions of embodiment or different ways of experiencing the world that was just not built for that particular body or that particular neurobiology. And just like really appreciating that reframing and that whole flipping on the that like the whole flipping the whole thing on its head, kind of, you know.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing like a vulnerable piece of yourself too, because I think that is so just like your voice and your lived experience is really helpful. I think one thing from the podcast is I don't remember in which one it was because it was the same Professor Swinton, I'm pretty sure. But he had said something up along the lines of it's more about vocation, not help. And I really love that. So post grad, my first job, it was this really a very niche area of social work where I was helping people with both physical and mental disabilities find jobs. And the whole
Mhm.
thing was like, we're not finding people a job that like pays less or that is
Mhm.
whatever. It's like everybody deserves meaningful work that they're passionate about, that they're good at. And I really just ran into so many situations where, like, I think sometimes in my social work bubble, I'm like, people in the world aren't really like that. But then I would call an employer and they'd be like, oh, they have a disability? They what? And you're like, that's a crazy thing to say. Like, that's a
Mhm.
crazy take to have that, like, I don't know. I sometimes have a hard time seeing that within the world, people genuinely believe that people in differently abled bodies like can't do these tasks.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think like to my point and to your point, like the world was really unfairly made for a select group of people, which realistically was like wealthy white men.
Mhm.
And so like as a social worker, I think for me sometimes I feel tasked with like what can I do to change those things and not speak for the lived experience of other people and not try and step into a savior complex and like liberate, but like genuinely, how can I make sure that like there's more like safer crossroads for people who have a harder time seeing or just
Mhm.
things like that. Um, and it just, I don't know, I think clearly in my rambleness, like I feel really a lot of anger and frustration um, for people just taking like what so clearly God intended for people and twisting it into something that is negative or
Mhm.
terrible when it's like a beautiful thing. And I'm not saying it's not hard,
Mhm.
but yeah, I don't know. I know that was rambled.
No, that captured it really well. Um, there was also in the Disabled God where they were talking about like the church and how the church specifically has like othered or marginalized people with disability even through ritual and like the sacraments, and like the part where they were talking about the Eucharist. Um Here, let me see. Okay, I think I have the quote. Okay, yeah. So the author, she was saying the Eucharist practice segregates or excludes disabled people, and fails to celebrate the real body of Christ. And also like made the point that the church like would often glorify suffering or like frame disability as something like this person could miraculously overcome by the grace of God, and not seeing it as um like an authentic form of embodied like dignity. And so this quote in particular struck me. In the Eucharist, we encountered the disabled God, not as failure or defect, but as connection and strength. In his res in this resurrected Christ, the non-conventional body is recognized as sacrament. And I just thought that was so profound and like just beautiful in that said in that way. Like, um, yeah, the non-conventional body is recognized as sacrament. So, yeah.
I really like that you brought that up. That same thing stood out to me. I was raised in a church, and I've talked about this in our last group discussion, but it was called Assemblies of God, but it was like kind of non-denominational. Anyways, the whole, like from my understanding growing up, the whole thing was like healing through Christ. And so literally they would, if you had a broken leg, they would pull you up onto the stage and they would pray for you in tongues, and then they would expect you to just like literally walk off the stage and be healed. And it
Mm,
got to the point where people would literally fake these stories of healing.
mm.
Um, and with something like a broken arm, of course you want it healed, like duh. But I think it just got to a point where, yeah, it really highlighted what the church would deem weaknesses.
Mm.
And then fast forward, this is also maybe more of a personal anecdote, but my brother-in-law was caught in the crossfire of two gangs. This was like 2 years ago, and he got shot in the face, and so it led to a ton of physical disabilities. And in the hospital, it was those same Assemblies of God pastors who would come in, and it was like this overwhelming tone of he has to be healed. Like, what are we gonna do
Mm.
if he is unable to walk? What, like, that would be the end of the world.
Mm.
And I don't mean to minimize and say that that wouldn't drastically impact his quality of life or all of the things, but sometimes it got to a point where it's like, yeah, it was so repetitively negative.
But he's
Um,
still him.
yeah,
Yeah.
and he's still him, and he's
Mm.
everything he always was, and if not more, and has like a beautiful testament to God and like his provision for their family and for his life and all of these things. And so yeah, I just that same thing stood out to me and felt a little bit like I felt gross after. I think it brought back a lot of like those like traumatizing church memories, and so this felt very healing for me and like some of my own past.
Mhm. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
How's your brother doing?
So he can sort of walk, ironically. He can walk pretty well on his own, and then he can't talk, but he's still like fully himself and
Hmm.
like the same fun, amazing person. So, yeah, I didn't mean for it to take our of
No,
our
that
meeting to take a turn.
No,
no,
that's
we
It's
that's
just,
what
yeah,
the
in my head, it's been like the perfect example of
yeah.
disability theology. And even thinking about, like, Paige, you mentioned earlier barriers, or maybe it was Jay. One of you mentioned barriers. Um, and I think, like, even so, we live in the South where there was the big, like, district election, and he wasn't
Mhm.
able to go and vote. And, like, he
Mhm.
couldn't vote for the candidate who had specifically laid out policies for disabled folks in our
Mhm.
district. And
Mhm.
so it's moments like that where you're like, this world, we really do have a gap in our care for
Mhm.
people who have a disability.
Mhm.
And his voice mattered. People's voices matter. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So real work practice. Okay, so how will you integrate what you learned about liberation theologies to the practice of social work? As long as we're still on disability theology. So when I worked in with Build, um, I like the whole point of the program is so that the students are fully integrated into the college experience. So, and then they're also receiving individualized supports designed that expand their access rather than like correcting their difference. Um, and so I was a part of the support plan creation process. So we would identify things to work on with the student that they like identified as something that they were wanting to work on or wanting support with. And so then we co-created like routines or meal planning, or if they needed help with organizational skills. They really were the ones that were able to identify what it was that they felt like they wanted the support with. And then we would go through like role playing exercises and then rehearsing real world processes. So like budgeting and things like that. So everything about it was very like person centered, focused on their strengths, and then just really positioning the students as the experts of their own experience and like they know what they need. And like a lot of times students have gone their whole life kind of like even with when their parents like were well intentioned or their caregivers were well intentioned, sometimes the student like they still would feel like their voice was less or like they didn't really get to make choices that they felt like they could have made about their lives. So this was being in this program in this setting where they get to make choices just felt very empowering in a lot of ways. Oh, I just got the 10-minute notification. Okay, I'll stop talking.
For me, I would say that liberation theologies, they remind me to look at bigger systems, like systems that are hurting people, um, and not just like individual. I would say in social work for me, that would mean listening to clients' experiences, honoring their identity, and definitely advocating for change, because like just because there is a disability, it doesn't make you less normal than the next.
Yeah, I feel like the liberation theologies are really about the lived experience of people different than us. Um, and so I think as social workers, it's so important to just like sit and listen and be able to hear and take what someone else is saying to you as truth. Obviously, if someone's manipulating you or whatever, that's different, but to just take lived experience as truth because it is. And I don't think that there should be any pushback on that. And when we can sit and listen and hear people, is when I think we can make change, whether that's to systems or
Mhm.
their lives or their barriers, whatever it might be.
Yeah, working alongside them instead of trying to like fix them,
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Um, all right. Any closing thoughts, or does that cover it? All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for being so understanding.